Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be going through every acdc studio album from High Voltage all the way through Power Up, picking my favorite and least favorite, best and worst song from each record. So there's a lot to get through here. Let's get started. So we're going to start things off here with the international release of High Voltage, and I'm only going to be doing the international releases. I won't be including the Australian ones in this countdown here, and I just didn't think it would make sense to include Australian TNT and Australian High Voltage and then go ahead and do international High Voltage at the same time, which of course includes the best from both of those albums. But don't worry, some of the Australian material that didn't make it on the international release of High Voltage returns on 74 Jailbreak, which I'll get into in a little bit. But that said, we're going to get things started here with this great international debut here. My favorite song from the record has got to be It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll. The quintessential Bon Scott era acdc song, just such an anthemic track, and the addition of the bagpipes gives this track, so much identity on the record, and that's Bon on bagpipes. And when they went to record it, everyone found out that Bon actually couldn't play bagpipes. He was the drummer in a pipe band, right? And so this is a really well done copy and paste job of Bon playing one or two notes on the bagpipes by George Young here, and you have that unmistakable classic riff to kick off, the international release of High Voltage here. And I think when it comes down to some of the best album openers of all time, whether it be on this version of High Voltage or on Australian TNT, It's a Long Way to the Top definitely has to be in that conversation. Everything on this album is tremendous, so it was definitely a struggle to pick a worst, but I guess the weakest on the record is probably Can I Sit Next to You, Girl? Originally a Dave Evans song, and Bon does his best to save it here, and I think he does, but something has to come in last, and this is probably my least favorite on this record. On to Dirty Deeds, Done Dirt Cheap here. Favorite song on the record has got to be Ride On. And, there aren't a lot of acdc songs with the same feel as Ride On. I love the soulful, bluesy approach the band took to this track, and there's definitely an element of bluesiness in the acdc sound that, Bon Scott kind of took with him, right? And, in the Brian Johnson era, it just didn't hit the same, and they didn't have that same approach. But, to have tracks like a Ride On or a Night Prowler, I'll get to in a little bit, it really makes the Bon era unique, in my opinion. I love Angus's bluesy solo here, and it has some of my favorite Bon Scott vocals of all time. His lyrics here are tremendous, and of course Bon was known for his witty, double entendre lyrics, but his deeper, more reflective lyrics on Ride On, I think, take on a whole different meaning, after his passing as well. But just great stuff here, great writing by Bon, and this is another one of those essential Bon Scott songs, and I think one of his finest hours in the band. And as for the worst on Dirty Deeds, I guess I gotta go with Love at First Feel. I feel like the album loses a little bit of steam with Love at First Feel. Not a bad song by any means, but definitely a least favorite pick. I'd say more than a worst. A lot of people would say There's Gonna Be Some Rockin' is the default worst on the album, and it's definitely not an all-time classic, but I think Love at First Feel is a bit more generic and forgettable. And back to how the album loses a bit of steam, I think it really picks up again with Rocker. You have Love at First Feel and Big Balls. Big Balls is very fun, but after Dirty Deeds, the title track, you have Love at First Feel and Big Balls. It's not until Rocker that the album picks back up, in my opinion. There is no wrong answer for Let There Be Rock. It is a perfect album from top to bottom, so realistic, I could go with any cut from this record, and, when it comes to my favorite here, it changes all the time, but today I have to go with Overdose. I love that song to death. Such an underrated deep cut, and the music, much like the rest of this album, just feels raw and heavy, and the main riff is amazing. I love the slow build intro where Angus and Malcolm start playing the riff together. It's such a great jam, and definitely worth checking out the Exodus cover of Overdose as well. And acdc are a tough band to cover, but I think they do a great job with it. And the worst on this album, on a technicality, is Problem Child from Dirty Deeds, right? Well, apparently not. So I didn't notice this until I really studied the track listing for both Dirty Deeds and Let There Be Rock, but Problem Child appears twice, right? It was originally recorded for Dirty Deeds, and then the version from Let There Be Rock is a shortened version of the original, missing the reprise coda. So it just seems unnecessary that Problem Child appears on two records, and in my opinion, they should have put Crab City in Blue on the international release of this album instead. And, I definitely lucked out massively with this one, because if not for going with Problem Child with a bit of an asterisk next to it, I would have had absolutely nothing for Let There Be Rock, because like I said, it's a perfect record. There is no bad song on here, but I think including Problem Child on two back-to-back studio albums definitely was a bit of a misstep. I think it was kind of random, and again, like I said, I definitely love to have heard Crab City in Blue in its place on the international version. Powerage is perfect. I don't think there's a worst, but even harder is picking a best for this album because every song is amazing, and so it just comes down, to personal preference, like all of these do. And so I'm gonna go with Riff Raff. If you ask me again next week, I might have a totally different favorite here, but that's just a testament to how great this album is. Riff Raff is such a great rocker of a track, and living up to its name, some of the best riffs on this record are on Riff Raff, and I think it's a great representation of the band's high energy sound as well, which is really cool. This makes for a tremendous mid-album rocker here. I think kind of pick up the pace on the record, and a phenomenal live track as well. It's really just a matter of the least great song on Powerage, and so for that, I have to go with Gimme a Bullet. For the record, I love this track. I think it's a really unique song, and, it's one of the few AC/DC songs where the bass kind of deviates from the guitar riff and does its own thing, which is really cool, but having to nitpick massively when it comes to an album like Powerage, this is the only song on the record without a guitar solo, and while I don't think the lack of a solo hurts the song, it could have only made it stronger. On to Highway to Hell here, the final album of the Bon Scott era from 1979, and I alluded to my favorite a little bit earlier in this video here. I have to go with Night Prowler, another one of those great bluesier AC/DC tracks, and part of their sound they weren't quite able to replicate as well in the Brian Johnson era. This is my favorite Angus Young guitar solo of all time, and the entire track is just so heavy. The lyrics and delivery by Bon, set such an unsettling atmosphere, and the backing vocals are super prominent as well, which I love. I usually, Malcolm and Cliff's backing vocals are in the background, but on this whole album, they feel like they're brought to the forefront, which I think is really cool and adds a whole other layer to really this entire record, but to this song specifically. And the worst, this is another album where every song on here is great, but I guess Get It Hot is my least favorite on the record. I think the demo version is, far better than the version that made the studio album, and really like Malcolm's rhythm guitar on this one, but just in general, it's more of a filler track from Highway to Hell, probably to bolster the 10 songs more than anything else. After Bon Scott's passing in early 1980, the band carried on, bringing in former Geordie vocalist Brian Johnson for Back in Black, the band's most successful commercial record, and really the one that made them household names, right? Back in Black kicks off with Hell's Bells, my favorite song on this album, and I've heard, Back in Black, the whole record to death, but I can never get tired of this song. The evolving main riff, written by Malcolm and Angus, is one of my favorite parts of, any AC/DC song, just throughout this entire track. I love it. This was the first song on Back in Black, and it made for a perfect way, I think, to introduce Brian Johnson to the AC/DC fans. His lyrics and vocals here are so powerful. It's an epic album opener, and I think, like I said, a great way to start off the Brian era strong. Again, this is difficult because Back in Black is another perfect album, and, I really enjoy this track, but if I had to go with the worst, it would have to be Let Me Put My Love Into You, and as far as album filler goes, this is still a great song, but it's just not on the same level as the rest of Back in Black. It pales in comparison to some of the heavy hitters on here, and even some of the deeper cuts, like, What Do You Do for Money, Honey, or Shake a Leg. The main riff isn't bad, but the lyrics are definitely the worst on the album, in my opinion, and, it definitely sounds like Brian trying to write like Bon Scott here, and it just doesn't work too well. I think both guys have very different writing styles, and I can't imagine Bon writing Brian's lyrics and vice versa. Next, we have For Those About to Rock. Great record here. I think definitely exists in the shadow a bit of Back in Black, but still a phenomenal album from top to bottom. My favorite on this record has got to be Night of the Long Knives, and this is a dark horse pick for sure, but one of my favorite AC/DC deep cuts from the Brian Johnson era. I think it's one of Brian's best vocal performances on the album, which, is full of great vocals. Brian's just screaming on this entire record, and the riff on here it really seals it for me. And what's wild is that, Angus and Malcolm could write riffs like this in their sleep, and this is a great one for a track that they probably considered to be a throwaway song for side 2 of the record, and I'd say any band would probably kill, to be able to write disposable riffs like this. It's such a lost hidden gem, I'd say, buried in a catalog, and it's always been a standout for me. I love it, and it's one of my favorites in the entire Brian Johnson era, but really a dark horse pick that steals For Those About to Rock for me. Great song from side 2. I'm going to stay with side 2, or For Those About to Rock, for my least favorite on the album here, and go with Breaking the Rules. Not bad at all, but this song just seems very generic. Nothing too special about this track. I like the backing vocals in the chorus, but it's definitely album filler, and, while Night of the Long Knives was likely intended to be filler as well, I could just never take to this one in the same way. 1983's Flick of the Switch, one of my favorite acdc albums of all time, and I think it's aged really well despite getting a lukewarm reception when it came out. It's a total hidden gem of a record full of excellent deep cuts and some of the band's heaviest material and crunchiest riffs. I mean, I'll never understand why some people don't like this album or write it off. There's some phenomenal stuff on here, in my opinion. I think the title track is a great example of that, so my favorite's got to be Flick of the Switch. This is a so brilliantly done song. There's no frills here, nothing fancy, just raw rock and roll, and you gotta love it. The band are rocking here, and there's a filthy riff going on, just at a blistering pace as well. Awesome song, lots of fun to listen to, as is this whole record, and I think it features some of Angus and Malcolm's best dual guitar work. In another case of a song that's maybe just the least great on the album, and maybe that's my bias to Flick of the Switch coming through, but this whole album is killer, so my least favorite is still a song I really love, and that's Brain Shake. I feel like the riffage on this track is phenomenal, but it falls a little flat as the album closer compared to the rest of the record, and still it's a really good deep cut that captures, the raw edge and aggression that Flick of the Switch conjures up. Like I said before, some of the material that did not make it onto the international version of High Voltage from those first two Australian albums would return on 74 Jailbreak, which is an EP, so I'm going to make an exception and include it here because I think that material is worth talking about, and so when it comes to my favorite on this EP, it's got to be Jailbreak, the title track, and it's early acdc at its best here, originally recorded for Australian Dirty Deeds, which I consider to be the better version of Dirty Deeds, to be honest. I think once you listen to the Australian one, you can't really go back to the international version, but, Bon Scott writes some really powerful lyrics here, and Malcolm is just on fire on this track as well. The guitar riff is just an all-timer too, and Bon's delivery on this track is perfect, just adding so much suspense and tension to this song. It's an amazing studio cut, but I'd say even better live. The worst on here is going to be Baby Please Don't Go, a decent but unremarkable cover by the band, written by Big Joe Williams, and more of acdc loving their blues influences, and I dig that quite a bit, but, the band put their own spin on this song, which is kind of cool, and they really made it rock, but it was definitely an odd choice for the band to cover it so early into their careers and for it to open their Australian debut as well, which is certainly a unique choice. And within the context of this EP, though, I don't think it's on the same level as the four original tracks to come before it, but still there's some great drumming on this track. There's a nice solo too, and it's definitely hard to choose a worst on here for sure. Respect for Fly on the Wall. The production here is definitely the weakest aspect of this record, but otherwise this album rocks and is full of great deep cuts, including Back in Business, my favorite song on the record. This is, one of the songs I think that nobody talks about, but the chorus just hits like a ton of bricks. It's one of the more powerful and explosive on the record, and there's some killer backing vocals on here as well, and, I never understood why people don't like this track. It's fun stuff, and, Fly on the Wall is full of fun, hard-rocking material that nobody ever mentions. But as fun and underrated as Fly on the Wall is, there's no doubt that the lyrics were getting a bit stale by this point. Brian Johnson, as the band's main lyricist, was creatively tired, and Stand Up isn't really anything special. My least favorite song on this record, it just feels like a forgettable cookie-cutter song, and people cite songs like this when talking about the lows of Fly on the Wall. Personally, I like to focus on the highs, which I think are very underappreciated, but I can't deny that some of the material on this record isn't quite top-shelf acdc, including Stand Up. Time for Blow Up Your Video from 1988 here. Favorite song has got to be That's the Way I Want to Rock and Roll. A really catchy, radio-friendly song for the band on what's probably my least favorite record of theirs, to be honest. But I think Heat Seeker and That's the Way I Want to Rock and Roll make for a great 1-2 punch to start off the record with, some high energy, right? Some great rocking songs there. And unfortunately, the album takes a pretty lackluster turn after that. Like I was mentioning before, the mid to late 80s, the band started to struggle with their songwriting, and it's only normal to develop some writer's block after a string of great albums. This would be the last record in which Brian Johnson was the main songwriter, and it was definitely time for a change. This album definitely features some of Brian's weakest lyrics, like on a song such as Go Zone, my least favorite on the record, and it's like he wasn't even trying at this point, but, I believe he was trying. I just believe he was sapped for good ideas by this point, and Go Zone is forgettable at best, and definitely part of the indication that it was time for Angus and Malcolm to take some of the burden off of Brian when it came to his songwriting duties. into the 90s here with the Razor's Edge album, and I guess the front runner would probably be Thunderstruck, a great lead single, that kind of restored the band to the commercial success they had enjoyed years earlier, but they were less successful, of course, in the mid to late 80s, but I've heard that song to death, and I've gained more of an appreciation for some of the deeper cuts on this album, such as the title track, AC/DC's take on a more metal sound here, and it's the heaviest song on the record with a really ominous vibe and sinister backing vocals as well. Worst on Razor's Edge has got to be Let's Make It. There's just nothing special about this track for me. The lyrics are not great. I think the chorus sounds a bit forced. Razor's Edge is definitely a bit of a front-loaded record, and you probably could have cut this album down to 10 tracks instead of 12, and so when doing so, I'd probably start with this one. 1995's Ballbreaker is definitely the heaviest sounding AC/DC album in my opinion, and some of that might have had to do with the band working with producer Rick Rubin, but another aspect I love about Ballbreaker is the bluesy aspect of it as well. Parts of this album definitely feel like a throwback to some of the bluesy elements that we hadn't really heard as much since the Bon Scott era, like on Boogeyman, for example, my favorite song on this record. I love the dark bluesy intro to this song, which is just a really filthy riff to it as well, and I think it has a scorcher of a solo by Angus, and Brian has such a great blues voice. I wish they would have tapped into that a bit more than they did, but, the band did perform this song live on the Ballbreaker tour, and it sounded awesome, and definitely a track that I think should have remained in their set list after that as well. For the worst on this record, how about Honey Roll? I don't dislike it. As a matter of fact, I think all of Ballbreaker is, great and wildly underappreciated, but this song is my least favorite from the record, although I do love the little jam session at the end. Definitely the grooviest track, I think, on the record, but I feel like it's an outlier in the sense that it has a whole different feel than the remainder of the record, which I know is a super nitpick, but, like I've been saying for this whole series, if I didn't nitpick from time to time, I wouldn't have much of a video. Next, we have Stiff Upper Lip here. Best song on this record for me is House of Jazz, a forgotten hidden gem in the band's 21st century back catalog, and a lot of people overlook this track on Stiff Upper Lip, but I think it's a great tune. Cliff Williams provides some super bluesy bass work on the entire album, and Malcolm's guitar sounds great in the mix here too, and House of Jazz also has a great underrated chorus I think suits Brian's raspy voice really well. And the worst on Stiff Upper Lip for me is Damned, album filler that just sits like a rock on the middle of side 2 of this album, and just about every AC/DC song has something to love in it, but I'm pretty indifferent to this song in general. Just a pretty boring throwaway track with no real upside for me, and a rare miss for AC/DC in my opinion. We fast forward 8 years now to the release of Black Ice. My favorite song from this record has got to be War Machine. Such a powerhouse of a song this one is. It's definitely meant to be listened to loud, the bass turned all the way up, and I think it's also a great showcase for Brian Johnson's aged vocals. It can still sound heavy at times when he wants to. I love the version from Black Ice. My favorite version of this track is probably live from River Plate. Great live album, and this song sounds like it was made to be performed live, and it sounds incredible with that awesome River Plate crowd. The worst from Black Ice, in my opinion, is probably going to be Rocking All the Way. Black Ice is definitely a bloated record, and so it's only natural that some songs on this record are going to feel unnecessary or like filler, and Rocking All the Way is a solid, if unremarkable track. I think it captures that classic AC/DC sound, but really doesn't offer much beyond that, and Black Ice did not need 15 songs on it, in my opinion, and so if I were in charge of putting the track listing together, this is definitely one that I would have left on the cutting room floor. Following that up here with Rock or Bust from 2014, one of the first albums that I ever bought. Favorite song on here for me is Dogs of War. It definitely kind of feels like the band were trying to write War Machine again, but like I said before, I love War Machine, so that really is not a problem, and I think it's heavier than anything else on the album, and the backing vocals sound awesome here as well. Malcolm added so much to the backing vocals for AC/DC, but I think Stevie Young does a great job here in his place, and again, it's heavy stuff, and in my opinion, wouldn't sound out of place, on an album like Razor's Edge. I think the biggest problem on Rock or Bust or Power Up, the last 2 albums, is that they really front-loaded both records. And on Rock or Bust, I'd say Baptism by Fire is really the only song on side 2 of this record that I find myself regularly going back to, so the rest just kind of blends together and doesn't really stand out much for me, and so for an album that starts off with so much power and energy on side 1, I think Emission Control is a pretty weak and forgettable album closer, all things considered. One of the rare songs in the AC/DC catalog where I'm not a huge fan of the backing vocals, and it's not the fault of, Stevie or Cliff here, but I just don't love the delivery of the chanted pseudo-chorus. It just doesn't work for me. And also think it was an odd choice to have this track fade out while most AC/DC songs go out with a bang, but still, it's a fine track with a great riff, but just in general, one of those songs on this record that never really grew on me. how badly did the world need acdc in 2020, you know? I mean, there was a time when we didn't think acdc would ever make another studio album again, and so I consider this whole record to be a gift. You know, I think the lead single, Shot in the Dark, is a modern-day acdc classic and my favorite on the record. It has all the elements of, you know, classic acdc, right? All the elements you look for there, you know, from the recognizable intro, the great riff, Brian's older-sounding voice that can still rock, delivering those trademark acdc lyrics, and, you know, the solo is a lot of fun, too. And I think that this really did a great job of not only getting me excited for the record, but also kicking off the album when it did come out. And, you know, it's been a live highlight for the band on their most recent tour since their return to the road. You know, I don't want to go too hard on anything from Power Up because, you know, at this point, AC/DC making new music at all is a great thing. But Kick You When You're Down is a weird one, probably my least favorite on the album. The intro is a bit strange for AC/DC, and again, you know, more of those chanting backing vocals that I didn't like on Emission Control. And I give the band credit for being a little unorthodox here, stepping out of their comfort zone a bit, but I genuinely like every song on Power Up. But if I had to pick a least favorite, which I do, it would have to be Kick You When You're Down. A unique track, but a little out of the ordinary for AC/DC, and just doesn't quite click with me. So that wraps up this video here, taking a look at every AC/DC studio album and picking my favorite and least favorite, or best or worst song from every album, which I found to be very challenging. This might have been the hardest one yet, because AC/DC have so many classic albums, especially from the Bon Scott era. It was so hard to pick a worst for a lot of these records, and so this one was definitely a challenge. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know down in the comment section below what are some of your favorite and least favorite AC/DC songs of all time, and what are your thoughts on my picks. I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.